Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa were both New York City cops with long careers with the NYPD. They came from very different backgrounds, but wound up being partners when they became detectives. Their partnership, and Ippolito's family history, allowed them to open the door and to lead a path down the road of police corruption, with eventual charges of racketeering, kidnapping, and murder, as well as convictions and life prison sentences for both of them. Michael Cannell is back with another true crime story, Blood and the Badge, the Mafia, two killer cops, and a scandal that shocked the nation, which unravels the shocking double lives of two NYPD detectives.
We last spoke with Michael in Season 4's Episode 2, New York City's Mad Bomber, where he took us into the mind of George Metesky, New York City's infamous Mad Bomber. Michael is a journalist and best-selling author known for his deeply researched and compelling true crime narratives. His books, including A Brotherhood Betrayed, Incendiary, and The Limit, have explored everything from organized crime to unsolved bombings and high-stakes racing. A former editor at the New York Times, Michael's work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and other major publications. Michael joins us once again to break it all down. Michael, it's so great to have you back on the show. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I think of myself as a journalist and a reporter first. I have a newspaper background. First job out of college was writing obituaries for a small newspaper in Virginia, which was a great job, actually, really a great job, and learned a lot about how journalism works there from writing obituaries. I worked for UPI. I was what they call a stringer for Time Magazine. And I was an editor at the New York Times for a bunch of years. And then I started writing books. This is my fifth book. A couple of years ago was about Murder Incorporated, the assassination arm of the Mafia back in the 30s and 40s. In a funny way, this is a bookend to that because if that first book was about when organized crime became organized, this is about when organized crime became disorganized in the late 80s and the 90s. I think it became disorganized as a result of a kind of culture change in the Mafia. The old school Mafia bosses did not want the Mafia involved in drugs, but inevitably it was because there was just so much money involved in it. And so the younger kind of like middle management mafiosi were importing pot, importing heroin, they were importing coke, and they made a lot of money. And so they started to go rogue, and they didn't really want to follow the old rules. That was one change. And the other change was that Rudy Giuliani and other prosecutors used the RICO laws to go after the leaders, the top level of the Mafia. In the old days, there's that kind of, people tell that story kind of with a chuckle about Al Capone being convicted for tax evasion because they couldn't get him on anything else because he didn't pull the trigger. He had somebody else pull the trigger. Well, RICO changed that. RICO allowed the FBI or law enforcement to sweep up the entire conspiracies, as they called it. And so all of a sudden, there was panic in the ranks of the Mafia, and a lot of people flipped. A lot of people made secret deals with the government to cooperate and to tell what they knew. And one of the ways that the Mafia tried to survive, or at least the Lucchese crime family, was to put two corrupt cops on their payroll. And so that's what Blood and the Badge is about the career of these two high-ranking, decorated detectives who were secretly working for the Mafia.
What made you want to write Blood and the Badge? What made you want to delve into this area of organized crime?
Well, it has been written about before. These two detectives, their names were Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. They weren't a secret. They had been written about before, and certainly the New York City newspapers covered their trial. I felt like this was the darkest, most egregious case of corruption by certainly in the NYPD history, maybe in the history of the police in the country. And nobody had ever really told the entire story. So a little time had passed, and which I just recognized as an opportunity to go back to the sources. I don't think that the investigators involved, the police, the FBI agents, the DEA agents, I'm pretty sure they would not have spoken to me 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But a little time has passed. For the most part, they're all retired. Many of the players are in jail or have been killed. And so I think they felt like it was safe and appropriate to talk about it. And so I think that's what made the difference with this book, is that just a lot of people told me a lot of information and a lot of truly amazing stories that they would not have before, and that have not been published before. Unfortunately, some of them I had to cut out of the book. But honestly, while I was talking to these retired detectives and FBI agents, I felt like all these scenes that they were describing were straight out of a Netflix series. And it was like an incredible gift to me, and hopefully a gift to the reader.
A long way, Michael, obituaries to the Mafia.
Well, in a way, yeah, no, it's a long way, but in a way, it's kind of strangely appropriate too.
Who did you speak to when you needed to get the research and to write this book? How did you find how did you find them?
It's a really interesting question about reporting. I mean, some people I just contacted out of the blue, and they knew that I had written previous books, and maybe they felt like I was legit for that reason, and I wasn't going to waste their time. Big reason they spoke to me was that I forged a real relationship with the primary detective who broke this case, a detective named Tommy Dades, who was a detective in the intelligence division of the NYPD. He was set to retire. He was in some ways disillusioned after 9/11, and he was set to retire, and he just stumbled into some evidence, and I can describe that if you'd like, but he was one of the first people that I contacted, and Tommy just decided for whatever reason that he was going to trust me, and he told me his story. I've probably, without exaggeration, had hundreds of phone conversations with him. We continue to compare notes on things. Tommy is a well-connected and hugely respected figure in New York City law enforcement. And so he connected me with other law enforcement, DEA agents, FBI agents, etc. And when he vouched for me, I think they were willing to extend themselves and put themselves out. I mean, there were some people that I spoke to who would never had spoken to the press before. And so this was a new experience for them. It's sort of a viral phenomenon that some reporters experience, where you might speak to one person, they help you speak to 3 people, those 3 people help you to speak to 12 more people, and so on and so forth. So I hope that I became trusted in their community, and I think they could tell that I was just trying to tell the truth about this story.
What can you tell us about the relationship between Caracappa and Eppolito?
This is one of the real mysteries of all of this. It's a mystery. It's a mystery of the heart and a mystery of the character. Louis Eppolito, I should explain, was born into a mafia family. He was the son of a Gambino crime family capo known as Fat the Gangster, and his uncle was a capo known as Jimmy the Clam. And together the father and the uncle ran illegal rackets all over Brooklyn. Fat the Gangster, no great surprise, was a violent and abusive character, and violent and abusive with his son. And weeks after Fat the Gangster died of a heart attack, his son Louis rebelled against the family, rebelled against his background by joining the police department. For his family, the police were the enemy, and so this was really an unthinkable form of betrayal. Louis Eppolito joined the police department. He was a good cop. I mean, he was an effective cop, and he became a detective. He was stationed in a unit known as Brooklyn Robbery South. His partner was a man named Stephen Caracappa. Now, Louis Eppolito was a big, loud, boorish, vulgar, racist guy. And his partner, Caracappa, was like all partnerships, like many partnerships, they were sort of opposites. Louis was kind of loud and boorish, and his partner was very well-dressed, trim, thin, extremely quiet and circumspect. When Louis first joined the robbery squad, his partner Caracappa went to their boss and said, I can't possibly work with this guy. He's a loose cannon. And the boss said, I understand. Give it a month and come back to me if you still feel that way. Caracappa never came back. Somehow they communicated to each other that they were willing to collaborate on these illegal activities. Part of what happened here is that Louis could never really disentangle himself from his family. And so he found himself doing favors for his old friends on the Mafia side. And eventually, Eppolito and Caracappa were on a $4,000 a month retainer working for the Lucchese crime family. They were passing the Lucchese's information about who was under surveillance, whose phones were tapped, who was about to be arrested, and most importantly, who in the Mafia ranks was secretly an informant, who was cutting a secret deal with the government. And then what's more, to make this all more unbelievable, once Eppolito and Caracappa had identified the informants, they were paid a bonus to facilitate their murders. Even while they were working as detectives, they were involved in at least a dozen murders.
So you kind of talked about this, that Eppolito was born into organized crime and Stephen Caracappa, it was by chance? Or how would you say they both really got into organized crime?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's easy to see, kind of as unbelievable as it is, you can kind of imagine how this would happen to Eppolito. I don't think he ever knew if he was a wise guy masquerading as a detective or if he was a detective kind of pretending to be a wise guy. It's hard to know. But one way or the other, his identity was kind of mixed up with these two teams. For Caracappa, it was a little different. He didn't have a mafia background, but he was charged with a felony as a teenager. He was caught loading stolen construction supplies in the back of a rented truck. He was indicted on a felony. It was dismissed because he was a minor. He went to Vietnam and then he came back. So why did he do this? I mean, I don't have a definitive answer. Some detectives had said to me, of course he did it just for the money. I don't really think that's right. I think on some level he did this because the Mafia Association gave him a certain swagger. I think he liked having a secret life. And I think he liked the idea of pulling one over on people.
Honestly, in order to do this for so long and be okay with it, you have to like it. You have to actually want to be involved in it fully. And, since Blood and the Badge is kind of looking at the thin line between law enforcement and criminality, what's something surprising you found out about towing that line?
That's a great question. When I got to know Tommy Dades, the detective who busted this case that we discussed earlier, I was really surprised to find that he speaks on the phone today to a lot of the gangsters, including Sammy the Bull Gravano. These men on both sides of this line grew up together, and they went to the same schools, and they dated the same girls, and they drank and still do drink in the same bars. So if you were a kid growing up in Canarsie or Bensonhurst or Flatlands, Brooklyn in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, you went to school with gangsters, or you went to school with people who became cops, and a lot of them could have gone either way. I don't think, it's not really true today so much, but in those days, they were almost interconnected in a family sense. That was something I didn't know and found surprising.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I guess it doesn't happen now because there's just a lot more restrictions in terms of legality and RICO laws.
Part of what's happened is that, since I started doing the reporting in this book, a lot of people who are not really part of this story, just in discussion with them, have said what happened with the Mafia was that they moved out of the old neighborhoods and moved to the suburbs like Tony Soprano, like the Sopranos. And so there you have a Mafia family living in middle class or upper middle class New Jersey, and their kids are going to the local public high school. So many people told me, oh yeah, we had a birthday party in high school, and I realized like, oh, this is a mob family. So they're there. Part of what the entire Mafia story is about is assimilation and upward mobility. Think about Tony Soprano moving to that community in New Jersey and his daughter, Meadow, going to Columbia University. A lot of this is about assimilation.
So these two characters, these two cops, Caracappa and Ippolito, what did they exactly do in terms of criminal activity with the mob?
There are so many examples. I'll give you one example, and this is a story that explains how they became connected to Gaspipe Queso, who was the underboss of the Lucchese crime family and was their patron for many years. There was in those days a drug dealer, isn't even really the right word. He was more important than that. He was a sort of drug lord named Bert Kaplan, and Bert Kaplan was in and out of prison throughout his adult life. And during one of his stints in prison, he spent time, his best friend in prison was Louis Ippolito's cousin, who was a mid-level mafiosi. And as their prison time wound down, this gentleman, whose name was Santora, said to his friend Bert Kaplan, the drug lord, after we get out, if you ever need anybody in the police department to do you some favors, to render you some services, to do a little freelance work for you, my cousin Louis will do it. And he said he will do anything. And Bert Kaplan was not really inclined to do this because he just did not want to get in bed with a police officer. But there came a time not long after their release that, in fact, he did go back to his jailhouse friend Santora and said, I need your cousin's help. And the reason he needed his help was that he had hired a diamond dealer to sell stolen treasury bonds in Europe. And the diamond dealer was nabbed by the police at JFK Airport on his way back. And there was a concern that he was going to cooperate with the FBI and tell what he knew. So they knew that the prudent thing to do was to get rid of this diamond dealer. So Bert Kaplan, the drug lord, hires Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. They have police badges and they have a police car. And so it's not that hard to abduct somebody if you have these police accessories. And so they grabbed the diamond dealer, whose name was Israel Greenwald. They grabbed him on his way home one afternoon and they took him to a repair shop, a parking lot and repair shop on Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn. They took him into an enclosed one-car garage, and they killed him and they buried him. And Ippolito and Caracappa now had proven that they were reliable and effective freelancers. And so Gaspipe Queso eventually put them on a retainer, as I mentioned, for $4,000 a month. And they would do this kind of work over and over again. They also provided sensitive police information. Stephen Caracappa was in the Major Case Squad, which was an elite police unit that worked on the very top and controversial cases. And what's more, he was the point person for all of the information in the Major Case Squad. He had access to absolutely everything, not just police files, but also FBI records and DEA records. And so they would pass along to the Lucchese family, who was, for example, there was a loan shark named Anthony DiNapoli. And he was known as Fat Tony. And Fat Tony disappeared. And the reason he disappeared was that he was not sharing his profits with the leadership in the Lucchese crime family, as he was obliged to do. He just thought that he would take the money and run. So Caracappa, in his capacity as a detective in the Major Case Squad, simply called Fat Tony's parole officer. And the parole officer said he's moved to Los Angeles. Well, where in Los Angeles? Caracappa calls a detective in the LAPD, and they said he's living in Hollywood with a girlfriend. And so Luke Gaspipe Queso sends a couple of hitmen out there, and they kill him in the basement parking garage of his girlfriend's home. These were the kinds of things that Ippolito and Caracappa did for Gaspipe over and over again.
How did Caracappa and Eppolito get caught? And also what took so long? Because they were retired.
It took a long time, didn't it? I mean, they really kind of got away with it and got away with it and got away with it. Eppolito really should have been caught while he was a detective working in Brooklyn pretty early on. The police and the FBI raided a Sicilian heroin smuggler's home in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He was a man named Rosario Gambino. And to their astonishment, they found that Gambino had in his possession, in his home, his own police file. And what's more, they found that that police file had Louis Eppolito's fingerprints on it. So clearly, Eppolito had sold or passed along the police file to this Gambino heroin dealer. Not surprisingly, Eppolito was brought before Internal Affairs. Surprisingly, Internal Affairs acquitted him. Not only did they acquit him, but they promoted him to detective second grade. And they gave him the choice of whatever precinct he wanted to work in the city. So why did they do that? I don't have a definitive answer. My strong suspicion is that the Internal Affairs, with the police commissioner's blessing, did it in order to sweep a potential scandal under the rug. The city at that point had suffered through so many embarrassing headlines and corruption scandals. The Knapp Commission, Serpico. I think they just wanted to make this go away. But of course, it emboldened Eppolito and Caracappa, and eventually Gaspipe Queso, their patron in the Lucchese crime family, himself became an informant. He made a deal with the government to testify against Eppolito and Caracappa. He told them all about Eppolito and Caracappa. So now the feds know what these cops are doing. But something kind of unexpected happened, and that is that Gaspipe Queso started to call the other informants liars, most notably Sammy the Bull Gravano, who was critical to the conviction of John Gotti. So now the federal prosecutors had a problem on their hands. They didn't want Gaspipe Queso to corrupt other cases, particularly the cases that had already been prosecuted and won, because then the defense lawyers would be able to say, I want a mistrial, I want a retrial. So what they did was they just decided to tear up Gaspipe's plea agreement and send him away to Supermax prison, where nobody heard from him again. He stayed there until he died of COVID 4 years ago. So who was the beneficiary of that? The beneficiary was Eppolito and Caracappa, because now there wasn't anybody to testify against them. So they retired. They took their generous police pensions, and they retired to Las Vegas, where oddly enough, they lived across the street from each other in a subdivision. Why did they live across the street from each other? I think it's because Caracappa was afraid that Eppolito was, a loose cannon, that he might be a liability. So he wanted to keep an eye on them. And then Eppolito did something really dumb. He wrote a book. He wrote a memoir. And in the book, he said a lot of stuff. A lot of it wasn't true. He didn't describe these illegal activities, obviously, but he did put his picture in the book with Caracappa, and the caption had their names on it. And this made Caracappa furious, because now people who had seen them in the case in the course of their illegal activities could identify them. And that's exactly what happened. That was the beginning of the end for them.
This is not the first time where cops were on the Mafia's payroll, but I think this was one of those moments where it was really spotlit and out in the public. Do you think there's a certain kind of person or personality that blends those lines of being a cop and a criminal?
Yeah, that's such a good question. What sort of a person does that? I mean, I'm not qualified to make any kind of a analysis or diagnosis in a mental health sense. But I guess what I can say is that Caracappa and Eppolito both had this not just tolerance, but appetite for having a double life. Takes a certain emotional or mental makeup to be a double agent. That's essentially what they were. Were they sociopaths, and which is to say that they didn't have remorse? I mean, I'm not really qualified to say that. It is mysterious and puzzling, because they certainly had a lot more to lose than they did to gain. And Eppolito was a very devoted family man. Caracappa was very devoted to his wife. And why would they do this? Why would they do this?
Power corrupts. Once you get to a certain point, it's pretty addictive. You can't give it up.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's a really good point. And I think it's also probably true that, I mean, what comes to mind is that when Ippolito rebelled against his family by joining the police department, he found that the mafia techniques of bullying and intimidation and street justice that he knew from his father and his uncle, he found that they applied pretty well to working as a policeman. And so I think they did have this sense of they were kings and they could do whatever they wanted. And they were probably believed that on some level that there would be no repercussions because as they drove the streets of Bensonhurst, they were like little tyrants. They had a fiefdom. I just want to say at the outset that I think the vast majority of cops today are, and back then probably, were upstanding cops, good cops, devoted public servants. But back then, there was a tolerance for a certain level of petty corruption. And some of it was very petty, like, a free slice of pizza. Some of it was more serious than that. It was not uncommon for a cop who, if they were busting a drug dealer, might take the money from the drug dealer. But what Ippolito and Caracappa were doing was of an entirely different magnitude. They were killing for the mob. And when Gaspipe Casso, their patron, the underboss of the Lucchese family, flipped and began talking to the FBI about all of this, word leaked to the Daily News. And there was headlines on the cover of the Daily News. And Tommy Dades, the cop who I mentioned earlier, who really prosecuted this case, told me that he went to Dunkin' Donuts one morning in Brooklyn, saw the Daily News, and thought to himself, no way. There's no way that's true. Police officers who are actually committing murders for the mob seem like something you would see in a movie, but not in real life.
What do you think is a moment that would shock people the most in your book?
I guess what comes to mind is the episode of Nicky Guido. So at one point, Gaspipe Casso, the underboss, was attacked by a rival mafia faction, and they ambushed him while he was eating an ice cream cone outside of a strip mall in the neighborhood of Mill Basin in Brooklyn. And I would say, if you're going to try to kill Gaspipe Casso, you better do it. Because, is it a Shakespeare line? If you strike the king, the king must fall. Something like that. They didn't kill him. He ran into a restaurant and hid in the refrigerator in the basement. And then he devoted himself for years to tracking down everybody who was involved in this ambush. And he hired Ippolito and Caracappa to abduct or kill those people. One of those people was a really low-level mafia soldier named Nicky Guido. Gaspipe Casso relied on Ippolito and Caracappa to figure out where Nicky Guido could be found. Caracappa, as I mentioned, was in the major case squad. He was able to find the information and passed it along to Casso. Casso sent some gunmen. They shot Nicky Guido outside of his family home in Windsor Terrace, Brooklyn. The problem was that the Nicky Guido that they shot was not the same Nicky Guido. It was a case of mistaken identity. It was a different Nicky Guido. The Nicky Guido who was shot was by all accounts, a really nice 26-year-old who played on a softball team, went bowling with his friends, and he just had a Christmas Day lunch with his family. And, that's part of what you get maybe from what I felt, I should say, while I was doing this reporting was that we see the mob in movies and TV shows all the time, but in real life, this violence has real repercussions, both for the perpetrators and the victims. I mean, it's just a sort of sickening tragedy. And in this period, there was a lot of that.
Did researching this book change the way that you see law enforcement, either the positive or negative?
Well, despite the fact that it is a book about the worst corruption in NYPD history, the impression I come away with from getting to know a good number of detectives, FBI agents, DEA agents, is how truly dedicated they are. And I mean really, really dedicated. And they put their lives on the line repeatedly and must have post-traumatic stress disorder 100 times over. And they're doing this because it's their job and they're doing it for the public good. So ironically, this book about corrupt cops gives me enormous appreciation for the job that clean cops do.
I think you do a good job of not romanticizing the mafia, which happens in media. But I think your book does a good job of not doing that.
Part of what comes to mind as I hear you say that is how really tragic these stories are for everybody. I mean, a lot of these young men didn't particularly set out in life to become mobsters, but it was what was happening in their neighborhood. And everybody looked up to the mobsters because they had a lot of bling, they had a lot of money, they would walk into restaurants and they immediately got a table. They were treated with deference and respect in the neighborhood. And so these young men were recruited often when they were young teenagers. And then they would start to do favors, like very minor errands for the mobsters. And then they were brought along and cultivated, and then they're in it. Really, when you're in it, you can't get out. You really can't get out. As that story about Fat Tony illustrates, he wanted to get out and he was shot. So I guess what I mean to say is that everybody is a victim. Even the guys in the mafia, in some sense, are a victim too.
Was there a moment, when you were researching that you felt sympathizing with some of the people that you were writing about?
I have mixed feelings. I have sympathy for the reasons that I just said. Some of these people were trapped without even really knowing it. On the other hand, they did make decisions in their life and they did commit atrocious acts of violence. The ones I don't have any sympathy for are, I would say, like that in the mafia, there's kind of two categories. Most of the mafia members are like good soldiers in the army. They follow the rules. They were recruited. They follow the rules. They do what they're told. And then there's another category, which is like serial killers. I mean, some of the people in the book, and I do describe some of them particularly in the early chapters with the DeMeo crew, they were like people from Charles Manson. They were serial killers. And I couldn't begin to give you any kind of clinical diagnosis of what's going on with them. But some mafia hitmen simply enjoy this work and take pleasure in the killing. And, you feel no sympathy for them.
You said, you've written about crime before, organized crime. But what was different about this book? Was there anything that was especially challenging?
I don't know if it was particularly challenging. What was different is that this is a book that took place in the 80s, 90s. They went to trial in 2006. So a lot of the participants are still around to talk about it. So there's sort of, to me, kind of an interesting question there about nonfiction books, particularly in this genre that's known as narrative nonfiction. Think about who writes narrative nonfiction. It's writers like David Gran, who wrote Killers of the Flower Moon, and Eric Larson, who wrote, I guess his most famous book would be Devil in the White City. They really exclusively write books that take place a long time ago. And so their research is pretty much confined to archives, to letters and court transcripts, etc. In this book, in Blood in the Badge, I had the luxury of talking to living people. And to me, that's a very different experience, because to hear the people talk about it, to hear their voices, brings the story to life. Tommy Dades, the detective, really plays the role of good guy in this story. Grew up under really, really tough, impoverished circumstances in Brooklyn. His mother was a single mother, did her best to raise him while she had a full-time job. And Tommy said to me once, if you don't have a father, you look for one on the streets. And what he meant by that was that he developed a very close mentoring relationship with a couple of law enforcement figures, half a generation older than him or a generation older than him. I think it probably is true that if things had worked out differently, he might have gone into a life of crime. Possible, it's conceivable, and he might have said the same thing. He might have found that father in organized crime. But I guess to answer your question, the best thing I can say is that what was different about this was hearing people's voices.
The ones you've met, that's awesome. But the ones that you didn't get to meet, who would you want to meet?
Well, certainly Ippolito and Caracappa, who went to prison and died in prison, but also their benefactor in the Lucchese crime family, Gaspipe Queso, whose truthfulness would be in question, of course. More than anything, I would like to speak to Bert Kaplan, the drug dealer who served as an intermediary between the detectives and Gaspipe Queso. Everything went through Bert Kaplan. And partially that was to keep everybody safe. The idea was that nobody, for a long time, Gaspipe Queso didn't even know the cops' names. And everything was meant to be compartmentalized so that if somebody was arrested and flipped, they wouldn't be able to say very much. But Bert Kaplan was a brilliant facilitator of crimes. He could not join the Mafia because he was not Italian, he was Jewish, and I don't know that he would have wanted to join the Mafia, but he was one of these characters that you come across every once in a while who you get the impression they could have done anything they wanted in their life. In fact, he was recruited, he worked in intelligence for the military for a while and was recruited for a sensitive intelligence job, but he chose to move back to Brooklyn and pursue this kind of a life instead, I assume because he wanted to make money. He would be a fascinating person to talk to.
Did you get any feedback or resistance from anyone in law enforcement, like after writing this book?
No, but it wouldn't have been surprising if I had. I mean, I think it's a good question. When Tommy Dades stumbled into this bit of evidence that I mentioned earlier and began to revive the dormant investigation into Ippolito and Caracappa's activities, he did get a lot of resistance, particularly among the older cops and detectives who had a kind of a credo. They had a kind of code, which was we're not gonna investigate our own. No matter what these cops did, we're not gonna take them down because they're one of us. He got a lot of pushback, but he prevailed. I've heard from maybe 4 or 5 law enforcement figures that I spoke to, and they only had good things to say about the book, so no pushback so far.
That's good. What do you think is the most dangerous misconception about Mafia and the law enforcement that you really just want to bust?
The biggest myth about the Mafia, well, I guess what comes to mind is that the Mafia, I don't want to say that it's emasculated because I don't want to say that and be wrong, but it's certainly not what it was before. So it's not menacing in the way it was before. I think the wise guys are still out there in Brooklyn and elsewhere, no doubt. I'm going to guess that they're confined to loan sharking, gambling, maybe some drug stuff, but violence isn't their stock in trade the way it used to be. And I asked somebody about this once, and he said a lot of it just comes down to the simple fact that there are security cameras everywhere. It's just you can't abduct somebody or shoot somebody on the street without being on camera. That alone and the kind of sophisticated surveillance techniques and technology have gone a long way towards, I'm not going to say rendering the Mafia impotent, but certainly changing their profile.
Yeah, it's just not something you really hear about or see too often in the news. You hear about the smaller things.
Yeah, I mean, they're still there. If you were to get in your car and drive to Bensonhurst today and go to certain places, you would see there were people in the back room playing cards. And I mean, I think that stuff is still going on. They're not like they used to be like a shadow government in South Brooklyn. They used to be almost like a government. And I don't think that's true anymore.
Is it still that these 5 families somewhat operate, or like I said, you don't see much about it or read much about it, but is it still kind of the 5 families situation?
I think it is. I mean, I think the 5 families still exist. But back in the day, they controlled so many unions. They had their tentacles into everything in the garment district and the fish market and the docks, construction. I don't think that's true anymore. I mean, largely because the RICO laws were so effective.
You've looked into the mob in New York City, specifically like the Italian. Have you thought about investigating or just kind of looking into other factions across the country or maybe a different community and how differently that might be?
In the book, there's a section where I describe how early in his career, Gaspipe Queso partnered up with some elements of the Russian mob in Brighton Beach. I mean, I don't really know anything about the Russian mob, but my hunch is that the Russian mob is probably pretty badass and probably is still pretty violent, but I don't know. I mean, I think there are probably pockets of this kind of thing throughout the country. In the old days, that's the way it worked, almost like McDonald's. You know, there was like a board of directors in New York, and then there were these franchises in, Miami and Philadelphia and Chicago and Los Angeles, et cetera. So I think there probably are active pockets around the country. I just don't know very much about them.
You're kind of badass too, unassumingly.
I'll take it. I'll take it. Thank you. I don't feel badass.
Well, I think most people who actually are don't feel it.
Oh,
Yeah, they don't feel it. I think it's kind of cool that obviously anybody could be interested in writing about something like this, but you do have that journalism background, which, you're going to go and you're going to talk to people and you're going to dig and find out
yeah.
what you can and dig up information that no one's really discussed, in a particular way. That I think is kind of badass.
Well, thank you. I'll take it. Some people have commented on this book and the other books I've written have said, oh, you did so much research as if, and there's always like a little hint in what they're saying, which is like, you did so much drudgery. It doesn't feel that way to me. It feels like thrilling to me to do that work. I mean, it is pretty nerdy. Freedom of Information Act is like being like a very persistent librarian. But to me, it's thrilling, to kind of fill in these blank spots on the map when you're working on a big project. And certainly to speak to people and have them take what might otherwise seem like a Wikipedia entry. And when you listen to them talk about it, then all of a sudden it seems like a Martin Scorsese movie. That to me, all of that is thrilling. But like I say, some people have commented on the amount of research as if it's like worthy but boring grunt work. I don't feel that way.
We've spoken to a bunch of people who, have written, books in a similar way to you. And, even what we do from running this podcast, we've learned that people are more willing to talk than you'd think.
Yes.
And you're right. It's not necessarily like you're dredging up this old information or like you're searching so deeply. It's just a matter of getting people to talk because they'll tell you everything.
I completely get that. And I agree with you. It is surprising. I mean, it doesn't really apply to this book, but earlier in my life as a reporter, I have found, number one, that people who seem reluctant to talk, they're the ones who end up talking the most. And number two, sometimes people talk to the extent that you want to remind them that maybe they should think about what they're saying because they're talking to a reporter or, in your case, a podcaster.
It's on record.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think the timing of the book is important? Could you have written this book in the 80s or the 90s?
What an interesting question. If I were writing about Eppolito and Caracappa, as I said early on, I think that probably for practically any project, it's helpful to have a little time pass because things settle and you have a little perspective and your sources have a little perspective and it isn't so volatile or inflammatory or sensitive that people are reluctant to talk about it. I guess there are some small ways in which, sort of small practical ways in which it's easier to do this kind of thing now than it would be in the 80s, by which I mean archival things are digitized, but not all. Newspapers are digitized. Public records are digitized. Freedom of Information Act material can just be emailed to you. You don't have to physically go and try and dredge these things up and then photocopy them. A lot of that is streamlined. But I think those are small practical details. I think that probably people are generally a little warier of speaking to the press than maybe they were before just because of the way our national culture has changed. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
I mean, even if you had spoken to them 10 years ago, you would have had Caracappa and Eppolito still alive. Do you think even 10 years ago would have been enough time they would have even spoken about it?
Maybe. I mean, there is somebody had asked me, why didn't you speak to more of their family members? And I wish I had. I spoke to Eppolito's son, and I had some email correspondence with Stephen Caracappa's wife, but we never really had a formal interview. But there's some people who you want to speak to them, but you may not be heartbroken if you don't speak to them because you know what they're going to say because they've already said it. I think that's the case with Eppolito's family in particular. His daughter, who was very vocal speaking to the press during his trial. She was a very formidable young woman who would go and stand out in Cadman Plaza outside of the courthouse and stand there speaking into the microphones every day. And I wish I had spoken to her, of course, but like I say, I could practically tell you like word for word what she would say if she had spoken to me.
She's kind of like that person who's been in the press for so long that she has it down.
Yeah, she has a very honed message, and I don't think she's going to tell you how she really feels.
That's fair and understandable from her point of view, to just kind of even put some distance between all of that and herself. Thank you so much. Great talking to you and hearing more details about the book.
Yeah, I'm really flattered by your interest in these books, and it's fun to talk to you guys. You guys ask really good questions. Maybe we can do it again in a couple of years.
Yeah, we can't wait to see what you're going to be percolating.
Yeah. The writer, James McBride, he's a great writer. Anyway, in an interview, he once said, every writer is at least a little bit pregnant, by which he meant, like, we're all a little bit thinking about, like, what's going to come out next. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks to Michael Cannell for joining us on Bound by the Cloak once again. He's such a great guest and an amazing author. You can pick up Michael's book, Blood and the Badge, The Mafia, 2 Killer Cops, and a Scandal That Shocked the Nation on Amazon and wherever books are sold.
You can find links to Michael's website and other references on our website under the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, X, Threads, and TikTok, I guess. Also, subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any other podcast app that you use. We'll be back again soon with a fresh new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.